Sunset, Utah. Located 30 minutes north of Salt Lake City, it sounds like paradise, doesn't it? In 1980, the nearly 6,000 residents that lived there thought so. It had low crime rates and was considered a safe place to live. And totaling less than 1.5 square miles, everybody knew one another. It was the kind of place where most people didn't even bother locking their doors. But in 1982, all that changed when a 3-year-old little girl was abducted and later found hogtied in a creek 20 miles from her home. The events that followed left Sunset shaken. Theories ranged about everything from a possible snuff film to a satanic ritual. I'm Brooke, this is Armchair Investigator, and we're going to be diving into the disappearance of Rachael Runyan. As you're watching today's episode, be sure to let me know your thoughts on it. On Thursday, August 26, 1982, 3-year-old Rachael Runyan and her 2 brothers were playing at the Doxey Elementary School playground that butted up to their home. Jeff and Elaine had recently installed a gate in their backyard fence, so the family could have easy access to the playground. Elaine had gone inside to make lunch, everyone's favorite, Sloppy Joe's. Shortly before 1 p.m., when it was ready, she yelled out the window for them to come and eat. At first, none of the 3 kids, who were all under the age of 6, came running. Not uncommon. You know how kids can be while they're playing. So Elaine stepped outside to call for them a second time. And that's when she spotted them. They were further away than what they were supposed to be. In fact, they had left the playground and were at the other end of the field next to it. As the kids were running back to the house, she noticed it was only 5-year-old Justin and 1.5-year-old Nathan. Rachael was nowhere to be seen. When Justin finally reached his mom, what he said next is every parent's worst nightmare. He said, "Mommy, I have some real bad news." He told his mom that Rachael had been taken in a blue car with a man they'd never seen before. How could this have happened? Elaine said that it was the first time she had let her children play there alone. Things like this just didn't happen in Sunset. Justin explained all 3 of them were at the playground building sandcastles together when a man walked up to them and asked if they wanted to go get ice cream at Bobco's, a local store in town. That was enough to grab little Rachael's attention. When she told the man she liked bubblegum ice cream, he told her he had some. She'd just have to follow him to his car to get it. As the man started walking to his car, Rachael got up and went along with him, followed by Justin and then Nathan. The man was luring them away from the playground. Justin was old enough that he started to feel uneasy. He knew they weren't supposed to leave the park or talk to strangers. But it was too late. Before he knew it, the man turned around, grabbed Rachael, threw her over his shoulder, and told the boys they'd be right back. Rachael was tossed into the car, and the last image Justin has of his sister was of her, terrified, hands on the window, screaming while the man drove off with her. Panic-stricken, Elaine rushed into the house and made 2 phone calls. The first call was to her husband, Jeff, who was at work. She could barely get the words out that Rachael had been kidnapped. The next call Elaine made was to 911.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Officers arrived at the Runyan home within minutes. A picture of Rachael is given to the police along with a description of what she had on: a sundress with blue trim and matching bloomers. Then they wanted to see if they could get a description of the man who took Rachael and what his car looked like. Besides Justin, they were able to find a 10-year-old boy who'd also been at the playground and claims he got a look at the man and his car too. Both boys described him as a tall black man with a mustache and an Afro-style haircut who looked to be in his 30s. They said he was driving a blue Ford Pinto station wagon with wood grain paneling on the sides. It's believed he was wearing a blue Adidas t-shirt with a horizontal red stripe on it, blue jeans, and old blue sneakers. Apparently, the man had been hanging around, talking to children and drinking coffee for at least 15 minutes before abducting Rachael. Police knew they needed to act quickly. Within 20 minutes, they had blocked off the roads in and around the city and were searching cars in hopes of finding Rachael. Elaine and Jeff were doing what they could to find her too. They went to Bobco's, that local store I was telling you about earlier, in hopes that whoever took their daughter had actually gone there with her. But nobody had seen her. It was as if Rachael, her kidnapper, and the blue Ford Pinto had vanished into thin air. The next morning, a full-scale investigation is launched. Police bring in a sketch artist to work with 5-year-old Justin and the 10-year-old boy from the playground to create a composite sketch of the kidnapper. The family passed out flyers, missing person posters, and held fundraisers to raise a reward for Rachael's return. Because it was such a small-knit community, everybody helped. They all wanted to see sweet little Rachael come home. Soon, the reward was over $40,000 for her safe return. Search parties combed the wooded areas around Sunset on foot. But nothing turned up. The Runyans even rented a plane to fly over the area in hopes that an aerial view might unearth something. By the 4th day, with no new updates or information, Rachael's family began to fear the worst. They were losing hope of ever seeing her again. They could only imagine what this sick monster wanted with her. They knew the kidnapping wasn't motivated by money because they hadn't received a ransom note, and the $40,000 reward for her safe return hadn't been claimed. Could she have been trafficked or stolen for an illegal adoption? It was possible, but that meant this was bigger than just searching the state of Utah. If their theory was true, it meant she could be anywhere. So, 11 days after Rachael's abduction, Elaine and Jeff appear on the Today Show, urging anyone with information about their daughter's disappearance to speak up. They also ask that anyone who's in the process of adopting a little girl to please be certain that it wasn't Rachael. Somebody somewhere had to know something, but if they did, they were tight-lipped. Nobody was coming forward, and all the Runyans could do was wait in agony. Nearly a month after Rachael's abduction, on the evening of September 19th, Elaine and Jeff would receive an update about Rachael. It would squash all hope of ever seeing their daughter alive again. You see, a family was spending the day up in the mountains of Morgan County, about 20 miles away. They had pulled off to the side of the road so they could stretch their legs and let their kids play in the nearby stream. As they were throwing rocks, the children spotted what appeared to be a doll in the water, but they couldn't get a good look because it was partially hidden by brush. Upon closer inspection, they were horrified to see that it wasn't a doll at all. It was a little girl. Her hands and feet had been bound with parachute cord, a lightweight nylon rope. Now, even though investigators were pretty positive it was Rachael, she still had to be formally identified. A task that proved difficult due to how badly decomposed her body was, and she didn't have any dental records. Unfortunately, the only other option was to have her family make the identification. There was no question about it. It was Rachael. But how and when did she die? It was difficult to answer both of those questions. Investigators knew she had been in that creek for a while, but just how long was something only her killer knew. There were no visible wounds on Rachael's body to indicate that she'd been stabbed or shot. It seemed more than likely that she'd been strangled, but the medical examiner couldn't be sure of that either due to how badly decomposed her body was. Shortly after Rachael's body was found, police locate some of her clothing near the stream. They appeared to have been burned. 4 days after she was found, on September 23rd, Rachael was finally laid to rest with one of her favorite Raggedy Ann dolls. It seemed like the whole town was in mourning. Hundreds attended the little girl's funeral. Written on her gravestone were the words, "She brought a nation to its knees." The man who had done this horrific thing was still out there, and police wanted to get him off the streets as soon as possible. Tips were pouring in left and right, and investigators followed up on all of them. One tip came in from a man that claimed he knew the reason behind Rachel's murder: a snuff film, a video genre that shows an actual murder. This is different than, say, showing footage of deaths in war or an accidental death, because a murder committed for a snuff film is done solely for the purpose of that film. The term snuff film gained popularity in 1971, 11 years before Rachel's abduction and murder, when it was rumored that Charles Manson and his family murdered someone, filmed it, and then hid the film in the desert. Now, we don't know if that's true or not because no film has ever been found. Investigators working Rachel's case weren't exactly sold on the whole snuff film theory. Either way, they knew they were dealing with somebody who was seriously sick and demented. Not long after Rachel's funeral, her father Jeff was visiting her grave when he noticed something laying on her headstone that immediately made him feel sick to his stomach. A single black rose. And then a few days later, another one showed up. The Runyans couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was leaving these black roses was the same person who had abducted and murdered their daughter. Police never figured out who was leaving them. Instead, their attention shifted to the idea that Rachel had fallen victim to serial killer Arthur Gary Bishop. In 1983, so not long after Rachel's abduction, he confessed to kidnapping and murdering young children around the Salt Lake City area beginning in 1979. Police liked him for it because all of his victims were between 4 and 13 years old. And much like what happened to Rachel, Arthur would lure his victims with promises of free candy. Sounds like our guy, right? There's just one caveat. All of Arthur's victims were boys. Police still questioned him about Rachel, but he denied having anything to do with her murder. Tips and leads slowly stopped coming in, and eventually the case went cold. Until 1985. Police receive a call from someone who had stumbled across a troubling message in the men's restroom at a local 24-hour laundromat. The writing was in all caps and said, "Beware, I'm still at large. I killed the little Runyan girl. Remember, beware." And that wasn't all. Underneath the message was a drawing of an upside-down cross and 3 sixes. Safe to say, it sent chills down everyone's spine. Was Rachel's killer toying with them? Had he been lying low for the last 2 years, only to resurface and wreak havoc again? Police take the portion of the door that contained the message and interviewed anyone who had been at the laundromat. But nobody saw who wrote the message, and the laundromat didn't have surveillance cameras. It did, however, give detectives a new theory to consider, that a satanic cult had been involved in Rachel's kidnapping and murder. But other than the upside-down cross and the 3 sixes, there was nothing else for them to go on, and the case went cold again. This time for another 4 years. And then in April of 1989, investigators receive a tip from a woman that claims she knows who killed Rachel. Not only that, the killer was her own brother. Listen to this. She claimed that Rachel's murder was videotaped and made into a snuff film. Sound familiar? It was one of the first tips detectives had looked into 6 years ago. And here's the thing. Police never went public with that theory when they first heard about it in 1982. Investigators felt it was a good lead to pursue, and the woman agrees to become a confidential informant for them. The plan was for her to arrange for an undercover agent to buy a copy of the snuff film her brother had made. Agents tried 3 different times to purchase the film, but it never worked out. And after the 3rd attempt, authorities charged her with theft by deception and obstructing justice. This was something I kept coming back to. It really seemed that the woman was telling the truth. Why would anyone voluntarily contact the police and fabricate a story like this? And remember, police never publicly mentioned anything about a snuff film. But it turns out she pled guilty to both charges and recanted most of the information she told police. She served 40 days in Weber County Jail. Investigators still felt like the snuff film was their strongest lead. So much so that In 1989, when Rachel's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, it was the main theory discussed.
Recently, law enforcement officials in Utah contacted us with an urgent request. Police believe they are very close to solving one of the most appalling crimes in the state's history. They hope that someone watching tonight may be able to supply the final piece of evidence. They are offering a $20,000 reward for information leading to a conviction in this case.
After that episode aired, calls started pouring in from all around the country. Detectives fielded over 150 new tips. But not a single one brought them any closer to finding Rachel's killer. And you guessed it, the case goes cold again. This time for 3 decades. Until private investigator Jason Jensen began looking into it. Maybe a new perspective is exactly what Rachel's case needed. You see, he asked a question that, up until 2019, no one had thought to ask. Was it possible that whoever abducted Rachel wasn't a black man? If you remember, back in 1982, Justin and a 10-year-old witness had described the man who took Rachel as a tall black man with a mustache. But what if he wasn't? Upon reaching out to the Runyans, he posed the question, is there any possibility that your son may have witnessed a Hispanic male instead of an African American? And listen to this. Justin didn't think the man was black. He just remembered him as having a dark complexion. Justin said, I wanted them to change some things, but police wouldn't. And it wasn't until I was older and met with the FBI. And they said it was because the other kid was 10 and he knew better. The fact that there were discrepancies over the man's description isn't all that surprising. Eyewitness memories provide a critical source of information during any investigation. But here's the thing. It's often found to be unreliable, even when a witness is trying to provide a sincere and accurate account. According to the Innocence Project, 71% of the 358 people who were convicted and sentenced to death since 1989 were convicted through eyewitness misidentification. They were only exonerated years later due to DNA evidence. Of course, by then, it was too late. I want to show you this interesting experiment done on a class of college students to test their memory recall.
You get hit under the kneecap.
You're watching Dr. Rob Guttentag teach a psych class at UNC Greensboro. It's Wednesday afternoon.
That's a spinal reflex.
And about 5 minutes into his lecture, this young man walks in.
You're a tad late, I think.
He's not here for class, rather the professor's briefcase.
Excuse me. Excuse me. You have all just been witnesses to a crime, and we want to see what good witnesses you were.
Dr. Guttentag asks the students to quickly write down everything they remember about the crime. He needs specifics here.
What did the perp look like? His shirt, his pants, and his hair.
Our suspect, Ethan, is waiting in the hall. You take a look. He's wearing a tan zip-up jacket, jeans, and he has brown hair combed back. A lot of students get these details right, but not everyone.
I thought he had like a beige fleece thing on with darker beige patches on it.
This student right in the front row said,
it was a tan vest and it had black lining.
He had a long sleeve shirt on with a stripe over the middle.
I thought he was wearing khakis.
We're looking for 5'6" with a vest and tan khakis, or 6'2" with blue jeans and a jacket.
How well did the students describe Ethan's physical appearance?
So most of you didn't feel you remembered anything about the face at all? Wow. His hair?
I said it was kind of mid-length, blonde, and shaggy.
It was blonde, though. I had blonde also.
Then Dr. Guttentag brings Ethan back into the room. And watch this twist that even shocked the professor.
This is the perp. This is Ethan.
That's not him. That's him.
Quickly, Dr. Guttentag picks up on the confusion and starts trying to influence the student's memory.
How many of you realize that this is a trick and that isn't really him? Put your hand up high if you realize that we brought a different person in.
I definitely don't think that was him.
How's he different?
His hair is slicked back, and I think he's wearing different jeans.
Again, listen to the student on the front row.
Like that. And I saw his vest. I don't remember seeing a jacket.
Put up your hand real high if you did think that the guy who came in was the perp.
Fewer than 10 students raised their hands.
How many people realized it wasn't him? Looks like about 80. Okay. This is him. This is him. This is Ethan. This is the person who came in the room before. He didn't change anything at all.
Pretty fascinating, right? That isn't the only experiment like it. You can find a number of experiments testing eyewitness recall and memory. Now let's go back to Rachel's case. Justin was only 5 years old when he gave a description, and he'd just witnessed an extremely traumatic event. And the other witness was 10, still very young. So fast forward to 2019, Justin, who's now 42 and with a lot more life experience, opens up about how he was never fully satisfied with the original composite sketch that was released to the public, specifically around a defining feature on the man's face, his mustache. One thing Justin could remember clearly about the man who abducted Rachel was that he had a distinct gap in his mustache. So in 2019, the Runyans, with the help of private investigator Jason Jensen, had the composite redrawn. But it still wasn't right. That's when local news station ABC4 Utah published their own rendition, making sure to include a gap in the mustache. They were hoping that with the announcement of a new sketch and updated description, it would drum up new leads. And it did. Not even 20 minutes later, a woman had come forward with information about her uncle, Joseph Lee Apodaca, or just Lee. The woman's parents had been wrestling with the idea of turning him in as a possible suspect. They initially believed that he may have been the person responsible for Rachel's death, but when police announced they were looking for a black male, her parents ultimately put the matter to rest. It was a good tip. Lee had a lengthy criminal history that included convictions for things like aggravated battery, theft, and sex crimes. His niece, who wants to remain anonymous, told ABC4 Utah that, quote, he had hurt little girls before. He had hurt one of the babysitters and did time in jail. That's why when he was around, we were kind of banned from going over there, end quote. And get this, he drove a blue Ford Pinto and kept it behind his parents' home, just 2 stoplights away from the Runyans' home. Investigators had always felt that whoever had killed Rachel was from the area, given the fact that he asked if they wanted to go to Bobco's for ice cream. You see, Bobco's was a local grocery store that had a small ice cream counter inside. So unless you were a local, the odds of you knowing that you could get ice cream from them was slim. Lee seemed to check all the boxes, but there was just one problem. He had died 2 years earlier in 2017. If they were going to prove that Lee was or wasn't their guy, they'd need DNA. In order to go about obtaining it, Jason reached out to Lee's daughter to see if she'd be willing to submit to a DNA test. She agreed to it. After all, it could clear her father's name. Her DNA was tested against DNA found at the crime scene, and in 2020, the samples were sent to Intermountain Forensics. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what the findings were, because the results are still pending. Private investigator Jason Jensen, who's still a fierce advocate for the Runyan family, is hopeful that answers come this year. August of 2022 marked the 40th anniversary of her abduction and unsolved murder. I think we can all agree that it's time for justice, closure, and peace for Rachel and the Runyan family. There is still a $65,000 reward for anyone who has information that leads to a suspect and a conviction. Anyone with information is urged to contact Sunset Police at 801-825-1620. As always, I want to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and hey, While you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on the next investigation.